Hello, this is Suresh Prabhu. Welcome you to another episode of Top Shot, a program in which we talk to some very distinguished personality on various issues concerning you and me. This program is a program in which you are interested in issues which we talk about. So today we have a very distinguished person from United States of America, a person who actually is acknowledged globally as an expert on strategic issues, Dr. Ashley Tellis. Ashley, welcome to this program, and in fact, welcome to India.
Thank you, Suresh.
Of course, you were born here, I know, and of course, not only you were born in India, but you were born in Mumbai.
Yes, indeed.
The place where I was born.
And quite proud of it.
Tell me, this visit of yours, what brings you to India now?
Well, I try to come to India at least once every 6 months.
Oh.
And this time I thought what I would do is come partly for the IISS event that is taking place.
What is that event?
This is the International Institute of Strategic Studies,
Okay.
in collaboration with Citi,
Okay.
is doing the first ever conference on looking at a rising India.
Okay.
And they have invited about 200 individuals from business, from academia, from the strategic community for 2 days worth of discussions on different aspects of India's rise.
Okay.
And so I thought this would be a great opportunity to come and meet old friends.
Yeah.
And I noticed that they have gone through the entire spectrum of people, people in business, people in industry, people in the strategic community. And so it'll be a good opportunity to catch up.
But is this an annual event, or this is the first time it is taking place?
This is the first time it is taking place, and they are hoping it will be an annual event.
Yeah.
And I think they've gotten off to a very great start. So I wish them well. I think it will be a great endeavor.
This International Institute of Strategic Studies is the same organization which is based in London, which is known globally as one of the best think tanks on these issues?
Absolutely. And what they have done in recent years is that they've begun to pay increasing attention to both India and China.
Okay.
Because they, for obvious reasons, see them as new emerging powers. And the IISS actually had always had an interest in India, in fact going back to the 50s.
Okay.
But that interest has now increased, and it has gotten a new lease of life. So
is it like, nowadays we see that so many firsts are taking place in India. We are seeing now that first time the world is really discovering India.
Yes.
In our modern times. Of course, India was discovered many, many centuries ago. But why such an importance for India now on this global stage? Why suddenly we are seeing that everybody is talking about India? No global event takes place without mentioning India. Nowhere you can see, and you have to have an Indian for the event to be completed.
Yes.
Why so much of renewed interest in India now?
I think it's part of a larger development in international politics more generally. And I think there are 3 facets to this development that are worth thinking about. The first is that Asia itself has become more important than it was in the last 300 to 400 years.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I think of this as the return of Asia to its rightful place. If you think of the world around 1500, the Asian economy really was the world's largest economy, much larger than Europe, certainly much larger than the Americas.
Yeah.
Then you had the period of modernity and the epoch of colonialism, where Asia's importance progressively declined. And after World War II, slowly Asia came back. And so today it's recognized that Asia is going to once again become the center of the global economic system. So that provides one dimension. The second dimension is that within the context of the rise of Asia, China's own economic growth, especially in the last 30 years, which has been absolutely meteoric, has focused attention once again on this part of the world. And India, which was a country that people always had expectations about, but were disappointed because the performance never matched the expectations. Now India has provided, I think, the latest surprise, where since 1980, it seems to have broken out of the old low growth trap. And certainly since 1991, it has captured the global imagination as a country that can actually rival China in quality of performance. Now, it requires a little more time to be certain that that expectation will be borne out. But thus far, I think there has been reason for optimism. Yeah. So India is now back in the game, and for that reason, I think is a center of great inquisitiveness and attention.
So when you talk about now the renewed interest in India after so many decades of I would say disappointment, as you said.
Yes.
But tell me, normally the interest can arise because of two things. One is positive, because you're doing so well that I would like to be part of it.
Yes.
And something that we are a little worried about you, because you have a ability to create something, the nuisance value. Right. And is it something what attracts attention towards India? For example, when we had a nuclear test,
yes,
Pokhran 2,
yes,
that again renewed interest in India. Of course, for some time we were neglected. We were not neglected, but we were boycotted because sanctions were imposed. So is the interest in India positive, or is it because of India's ability to also have this possession of nuclear weapons also attracts attention towards India?
I think India has been very lucky. Because if you take the benchmark of comparison with China, for example, China certainly has attracted a great deal of attention for positive reasons because of its great growth. But there has been an inescapable shadow of concern that has accompanied China's growth. When people in Asia think about China, they think simultaneously of it as opportunity, but potentially risk. India has really escaped all the concerns that you would imagine people might have. And I think there are several reasons for that. One is India's great success as a democracy has had an effect. And the effect it has had is that it calms people down because they think that, if a country is democratic, if it basically functions according to certain norms that the global community sees as being valuable, it takes away the edge and the uncertainty and the fear. I think that's one dimension. The second dimension is that India is really a great example of a multi-ethnic, very diverse country that is really an example for many other, developing nations. And so I think between these two elements, its complexity, its diversity, and its democracy, it has turned out to be a remarkable example. And so today I would say that the attention is primarily for all the positive reasons.
But just imagine if China had not grown as much as it has, it was not considered as probably going to be the second largest economy of the world very soon. Would India had received so much of attention had it not been a neighbor of China and been considered as someone who could be a counterweight to China?
I think it would have received that attention eventually.
Okay.
But you're exactly right that being China's neighbor has helped in a positive way. That is, people now look at India, one, in that same frame of reference. That is, because you're next door to China, you cannot disregard India. India is there. It's part of the furniture of a rising Asia. I think that is certainly true. But I think people who think about this beyond simple geopolitics also recognize something, that the Indian experiment is in many ways far more unique than the Chinese experiment. For the two reasons that I mentioned earlier. One, it is succeeding under conditions of democracy. This is not an authoritarian regime that is engineering change by fiat. This is change engineered through popular consent, which is quite dramatic. The second element is it is change that is occurring in what is one of the most complex societies of the world. China, for all its complexity, is still predominantly a homogeneous society. I mean, it is a Han kingdom. It has other nationalities, but those other nationalities are quite peripheral to the Han core. India has no central core. The centrality of India is its diversity. And so I think this is a remarkable. This is a remarkable experiment, and I think people will pay attention to it in its own right.
I know, but sometimes when you get attention because of obvious reasons, like of course some of the intrinsic strength of India, but also because of its proximity to China and results like that. Is it something that because we try to believe in this euphoria that is now just generated because of this reason, and we start really believing that now India has come to a place wherein we are really become a global power? Is it something which will harm India's ability to deal with the real issues that are facing it back home. Like, for example, India is home to the largest number of poor in the world.
Yes.
India has large number of social disparity. The Naxalism is growing in India.
Yes.
So these are the issues probably we may gloss over because we may think now, see, we are now become a global power, so my time should be spent
Yes.
in looking at global issues. So is this a possibility that we should try to guard against? And
I absolutely think so, because while I think it is gratifying to see that India is at last confident that it can compete in the world, that it can succeed in the world on its own terms, those are very positive things. And India's 200 years of colonialism, which in a sense really damaged its psychology as a country, that is being remedied progressively as a result of success. That is all very positive. But I would say that it ought to be cautious about hubris. You don't want to be declaring victory when there is still a large agenda of unfinished business. And what India has shown is that it can grow. What it still needs to prove is that it can develop. And when one talks of development, one talks of something far more comprehensive than just growth. There are issues of equity, there are issues of ecological balance, there are issues of dealing with very complex and divisive social structures. This is part of the work in progress. And I think India has a right to be optimistic, and it has a right to be confident. But I don't think it has a right to be delusional.
I think I'm glad that you said that, because probably in this right now, the type of atmosphere that we live in, probably we just get carried away with that. Now tell me, basically nowadays, or for a long time, because US being the largest economy of the world, the only superpower now left in the world, people look at, from the US eyes, we look at the rest of the world many times. And even in this context, we are looking at it like this. So for example, India's, now the United States looks at India, and for a long time they were hyphening India with Pakistan. Pakistan, India, India, Pakistan. That's how they were looking at it. Of course, that has gone. Now they are talking about India, China, China, India. So sometimes it's good because that's the largest economy, so we get equated with that. But sometimes it is also quite a problem for India. For example, look at climate change now. In an issue like that, President Bush said even recently as a few days ago, when he said that I will not agree for the United States to commit to reduction in greenhouse gases unless China and India agree. Now, China has the largest emission, more than United States now, whereas India has just 4% of the global emission. So sometimes this comparison and equation with India, China, China, India, with even US starts to make it now. Is it something not necessarily always good for India?
Well, I think there will be situations where such comparisons do not turn out to be to your advantage. And Indian diplomacy in that sense has been very good to remind people that although you can make a facile comparison between India and China or India and the United States, one needs to be aware of the relevant differences as well. And you're exactly right that when you look, for example, at India's contribution to global carbon emissions, it is still relatively small, and it is likely to remain relatively small for some time to come. And therefore, I think there are two elements in the president's proposition. One is that if we have to defeat the threat of climate change successfully, we all have to do our part. That, I think, is a fair component of his argument. But doing one's part does not mean that everyone has to contribute equally, because that may not be possible. You're talking of different levels of growth. You're talking of different levels of capacity. And so I think the focus increasingly will have to be on equity rather than equality. And so this is something that will be the substance, I'm sure, of some very involved negotiations.
Actually, tell me, actually you went to US maybe a few decades ago, and you were born in Mumbai, as you were saying earlier. I mean, and now you actually, after serving with the State Department, a very prestigious job, then you are advisor to the US Ambassador in India, Ambassador Blackwell. That again was very prestigious. For an Indian to accomplish so much in such a short period of time, how did you really manage to do this?
I was just lucky. I don't think I can claim that any I don't have any special virtue that made this either possible or inevitable. I was very lucky, and I've consistently held to that view that I ended up being in the right place at the right time. Even my work with Ambassador Blackwell, who I respect enormously and was a very productive period of my life, it occurred through an accident. And I must tell you about this because to illustrate the point that I'm making. I worked for the RAND Corporation in the early 1990s. And I was doing a lot of work relating to South Asian strategic issues at RAND. And it was very fulfilling work, but it was for most part fairly obscure work. Because we had one big client, and that was the Pentagon. Yeah. We produced our work and we gave it to the Pentagon, and it was never heard from again. Now, it so happened that the president of RAND and Ambassador Blackwell were very dear personal friends. And Ambassador Blackwell was, in fact, the RAND president's best man at his wedding. So when Ambassador Blackwell was nominated by President Bush to be ambassador, he came to his best friend and he said, I'm getting ready to go to India. Do you know anyone who might be able to, give me a small briefing on India? And RAND's president said, well, I think I have just the right guy for you. You should go and meet him. And then one thing led to another. And, I came with the ambassador to Delhi at the embassy. Now, this is a very good illustration of the point, which is, I could not have planned this.
That's right.
There was nothing that I did that engineered, this outcome.
But what you did earlier warranted that attention.
Probably. But, I think there are lots of people who do lots of work. And sometimes never see the benefits of that work in this life, and in that sense the world is very unfair fundamentally, and we just have to be grateful when we get a lucky break. So,
and then what all you did there? I mean, after that you worked in US for some organization?
Yeah, well, after I was at RAND for many years, I was there for close to 10 years.
Okay.
I came to the State Department, worked in the State Department as Ambassador Blackwell's advisor. And then after we finished with Delhi, I went back to Washington and worked in the White House for a few months. In fact, at that time, the National Security Advisor was Condoleezza Rice, and I worked for her as the Senior Director for Southwest Asia and Strategic Planning. And after a few months, I left that job and went back to the Carnegie Endowment, going back to private life. And within a few weeks of leaving the US government, I ended up right back because the State Department called me up and said that they wanted me to, work as a consultant to the department. And so I've been working for State as a consultant more or less since then. And so
what is this Carnegie Endowment? What does it do?
The Carnegie Endowment is America's oldest think tank.
Okay.
It was started by Andrew Carnegie in 1910.
Oh.
Long before the word think tank even existed.
Oh.
And so we are going to celebrate our centenary literally within a couple of years. And he started it with money that he had made from steel. Oh. He was one of America's earliest capitalists. Oh. And he had made a huge fortune in steel. And he used that money to create this institution that was designed to study ways of achieving world peace.
Okay.
Now remember, this was started in 1910, before the First World War.
That's right.
And where there was this real effort being made to develop a world based on international law. Yeah. And Andrew Carnegie was a great believer in international law. Yeah. And so he started the Carnegie Endowment to look for ways to build up.
And that is, this endowment is trying to promote global peace?
Yes. And what we have is actually a very multifaceted program. We have a very large program in democracy, non-proliferation, the Arab world. We are beginning to do work on South Asia. So it's a very interesting place to be. Very interesting place to be.
I think this is also very interesting to talk to you on these issues, and we'll continue talking to you. We'll just take a short break and we'll come back soon. Don't go away. We are talking to Mr. Ashley Tellis, a person who has seen the world from a different perspective, and he's going to share his ideas with us. So don't go away. We'll come back soon. Thank you. So this is Suresh Prabhu. Welcome you back to this program Top Shot, in which we are talking to Dr. Astrid Tellis, a person who has, as I was saying earlier, a person who is recognized globally as a strategic expert. Astrid, we were talking about your organization, Carnegie Endowment, in which you talk about try to spread global peace. But no, now it looks like that, in fact, the peace is in tatters. We don't see peace anywhere. In fact, people say that one of the principal cause of disruption of global peace is the president's action in going in for war in Iraq. In fact, terrorism was something which he wanted to check, and terrorism has in fact increased because of this. So how do you look at the world now? Because it looks like a very unsafe place to live in now.
I think we are certainly in a very stressful environment. And part of the problem is because the very coercive political order of the Cold War has disappeared. Yeah. And once that order disappeared, a lot of forces that were below the surface, but which were held in check by the great powers, have now burst out. And this Islamist extremism that one sees in the form of Al-Qaeda, a very unique form of, worldwide terrorism, is one of these elements that always existed under the surface, but suddenly burst out. And ironically burst out as a result of decisions that both the great powers made, during the Cold War. I see this as something that we have to cope with. It's not something that anyone created by design, but which was produced because of very complex factors. And so we will have to find a way to manage this kind of a problem. I don't see this though as being permanent. I don't see this as being a permanent threat. If you remember in the 70s, there was a large upsurge of terrorism associated with the PLO.
That's right.
And people thought that this was going to be the new wave of politics for years to come. And within a decade, it really attenuated. I mean, we had a burst with the PLO. We had a smaller burst with terrorist groups in Europe, the Red Brigades, if you remember that, around the time of the Munich Olympic Games. And then over a period of time it abated. I hope that in the coming decade, we will see a steady abatement of the terrorism threat, particularly as nations get sensitive to the fact that they need to make some decisions about how to deal with challenges of this kind. Now, whether the US has actually contributed to the expansion of terrorism is a very controversial question. And people who have opposed the war in Iraq have always said that, terrorism has got a new lease on life. Yeah. My own view is that, to the degree that that is true, I think it is a very local phenomenon. The terrorism in Iraq certainly got a new lease on life because of the invasion. But my judgment is that Al-Qaeda is actually weakening. We have hit it very hard in Afghanistan. Of course, it is, metastasizing in new forms. But my judgment is that these new forms are considerably weaker. The global entity Al-Qaeda is no more what it was. And it has basically failed. It tried to bring a powerful state down and it didn't succeed.
No, but actually, it's a matter of perception. But if one looks around, then you see now new forms of terrorism emerging. In fact, the places which were not called as terrorist hotspots are now becoming hotbeds of terrorism.
Yes.
And in fact, the new young boys and girls are very young. In fact, in Pakistan, we saw that Red Mosque, Lal Masjid. There were people who were very, very young.
Yes.
In fact, the parents were trying to dissuade them from coming out, and they refused to do that.
Yes.
So, is it something which is, I think, in my opinion, a very serious issue, which I thought happened mainly because of people are now thinking that it's no longer a local problem in Iraq. Mm-hmm. They think that it's an American expansionism, which in fact is waging a war against Islam. That's why we should fight against that and try to save my religion. Is this something which is which you think is the right perception, or?
Well, I don't share that perception as a justified perception, but I know that many people feel that the United States is at war with Islam. And I think we have done a rather poor job in terms of our own public diplomacy, explaining what our campaign against terrorism is about. The US campaign against terrorism has one objective and one objective only, which is to go after groups that conduct their business through the murder of innocents. That is what this campaign against terrorism is about. Now, unfortunately, the ideological coloration has appeared as if this is a global war against Islam.
Yes, sir.
The fact of the matter is, the most important Muslim states in the world are American allies.
Yeah.
What is actually happening, in my judgment, is that there is a war within the Muslim world for a certain hegemony of what constitutes a right way of life. And there are people who feel that the traditional Muslim societies are corrupt, that their leadership has been very repressive, and that their leadership has stayed in power with American support rather than with popular consent.
Yes, sir.
And so it is this civil war within Islam that is being exported, in a sense, outside of Islamic societies. And so I can understand why people are confused, because what we are attacking are really these violent exports of what is an intra-Islamic struggle. And because we are attacking these violent exports, it is easy to demonize us as somehow conducting a war against Islam itself. And I think that is something that we do need to address.
In fact, when you make a point that this is an upsurge against tyrannic rules of some of the Islamic countries,
Yes.
Is the democracy a solution to this problem? That if you have a democratic setup in those countries, will it address the problem?
You know, to be honest, I'm not convinced that that is necessarily the case. One has to look at it on a case-by-case basis. Let's just start off with some broad generalizations. The broadest generalization one can make is democracy can be potentially helpful to the degree that Islamist violence is a product of a protest against essentially authoritarian Islamic states. Democratic institutions would help mitigate that problem. But, one has to make these judgments on a case-by-case basis, because there can be some forms of Islamist terrorism that are simply nihilistic. That is, they have nothing to do with a complaint against a particular regime. It is simply an ideological, bullheadedness. Now, if one faces a species of that kind of threat, then democracy is not going to help. You just have to find ways of defending yourself against, people who are basically maniacal. Yeah. And so I think one has to have a more differentiated view. And so one needs careful empirical research, more detailed analysis. But to the degree that it is caused by a protest against authoritarian regimes, yes, I think democracy would help.
And if that democracy is going to help, then as you said, the most of the US allies are also Islamic states.
Yes.
And most of the US allies are not democracies.
Yes.
And in fact, if on one hand US went to Iraq to bring democracy with an allies who are monarchs.
Yes.
So how do you actually reconcile to this contradiction?
I mean, this is, in fact, I think part of the contradictions of international politics. That the president had what I think was intuitively the right idea, which is the spread of democracy would be good for the region and for US interests. Unfortunately, I think that, the use of military force to spread democracy may not necessarily be the best strategy.